All right. We've got Ismail in South Africa. You're on with Dave and Matt.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
So I'm a believer. I'm a Muslim.
Okay.
I just had a few questions to ask Matt, not so much in terms of a debate format, more discussion so I can understand some concepts. I like Matt usually gives the example of the gumball machine for the burden of proof. And I think it can be stated in another way using the coin. Like example, if someone had to flip a coin,
okay,
and the theist would be the person saying, I know it's tails, and the atheist or agnostic would be the person saying, I don't know what's the outcome, but I'm open to either possibility. Is that like a correct statement of the analogy?
That's freaking perfect, or pretty close to perfect. The reason I don't use a coin is because it's at least hypothetically possible for a coin to land on edge, so it's not a proper 50-50 proposition, which is why I use gumballs, because even and odd numbers are in fact a 50-50 proposition. But everything else about that, the only correction I make is that the theist is claiming that it came up heads, and the atheist says, I don't believe that it came up heads, which is not the same as saying I believe it came up tails.
Totally.
It's not so much, it's not just I'm not aware, it's I don't believe your claim. What's your reason for that claim?
Mm-hmm.
But okay, because I was literally about to ask something about whether the coin lands on its side.
Yeah, that's why I don't use the coin example.
Okay, but hypothetically, if we had to say that, I know this is not your example, but I was just thinking about it like this, that in terms of the burden of proof, if, for example, we had to just change it a little bit and say that the theist says, I think it landed heads or tails. Okay, just a person, doesn't have to be the theist or whoever, says, I think it landed either heads or tails, and another person says, I don't believe that because it could have landed on its side. Where would the burden of proof, where would it lie in that situation?
The person who believes that it landed heads or tails. Hang on. The person who proposes alternate possibilities is not making an assertion that this happened, just that it is a possibility. And if you recognize that the coin could land heads, tails, or on its edge, no matter how improbable or unlikely it is, maybe you dropped it in the sand and it, made it a lot easier to land on its edge. The person who's saying, I'm convinced that it either landed heads or tails, it landed on one of these two and not the third one, they have made a claim. And that every time you make a positive claim, you adopt a burden of proof, whether or not you want to meet it or anything else. Now, the person who pointed out that I'm not convinced that it necessarily landed heads or tails because it could have landed on his edge, they've already, they are telling you why they don't accept your claim, because here's the third option. And as long as you agree that that is a third option, they're done. It's the person saying it's one of these two instead of the third one who has adopted a burden of proof to show that it's necessarily one of these. The other person's just saying, hang on, there's a third option. So if you say to me, you're convinced it landed heads or tails, and I say, how do we know that it didn't land on its edge? What's your answer for that?
Yeah, okay, no, I'd have to agree with that. That makes sense. But I'm saying, okay, just to go further, but would the person then be justified in saying, okay, I can't necessarily prove that it landed heads or tails, but I'm going to go with that because that's
Yes.
Better odds, right.
That is a completely reasonable inference.
Right.
Because we understand the probability of a coin, and we understand that it's pretty close to 50-50 on heads or tails, and that there's some fractionally, vanishingly small percentage that's going to be on the edge. And so it's perfectly reasonable to say, I am reasonably convinced that it either landed heads or tails. This is, if you're playing craps in a casino, sometimes the dice aren't going to land necessarily flat. They'll land cocked on something or whatever else. And we just re-roll. We just get rid of it. We toss that out. It's an anomaly. So if you are in this position where you're going to say, you know what, I'm just going to play the odds and say that it almost certainly landed either heads or tails, I will agree with you, and so will everybody else on the planet who has any inkling of an understanding of a coin and probability. However, now if we move outside of that analogy to where we're talking about whether or not a God exists, we don't even have a third option. Either some God exists or no God exists. Those are the only two options. They are exhaustively mutually exclusive. Either the proposition some God exists is either true or not true. Mm-hmm. And with only two options, How do you tell which of those two is more probable? You don't. Unlike the coin, we can take measurements, we can analyze, we can investigate evidence for what a coin's probability is. We have no way to assess the probability of a God, or whether a specific God more probably exists than not.
Yeah, no, that's. I would agree. I was more looking at it in the sense that if I have the two options, or let's just say I make a positive claim, is there a burden of proof then on the other person to show that there is another possibility besides the claim that I'm making?
No,
I don't think so.
And so here's the thing. Once we start, so we went from very specific example, coin, heads, tails, to something that is abstract. Oh, I make a claim. Does somebody else have a burden of proof to show that there's another option? No, they can, but even if nobody has pointed out any other option, the fact is you made a positive claim and you now have a burden of proof to demonstrate that your claim is correct.
Isn't the burden of proof always on the one who makes the claim?
Yeah.
Like if I were to make the claim,
there is no God.
I claim there is no God.
Yes, then we would be adopting a burden of proof.
And some people mistake atheism for that. They're saying, we're saying that there's no God. No, we're not. We're saying that you're saying there's a God, and we're saying, I don't see the evidence for that. Show me.
So yeah, when we're talking about a God, but we know the possibilities. We know that either for any given God, either that God exists or it does not exist. Those are the only options. They're direct logical negations. Right. So it's not like somebody else to demonstrate that there is another option. We know what the options are. What proposition would you make where you are putting forth an option and we don't know if there's another one?
No, okay, I didn't mean if you know there's another option. I meant like, okay, I understand your perspective. Actually, I agree with what you're saying. Okay. I just wanted some clarity on that. But just to clarify what I was saying like, okay, we know the other option, but do you have to demonstrate that other option is a possibility? Is that like, that was my question originally, but now I've got the answer to it.
So there's two different ways. There's two different ways of whether or not it's a possibility. One is an epistemic possibility, and the other one's a kind of metaphysical possibility. But it works best when we have concrete examples.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I can. Okay, so...
Well, I can. You're a Muslim, right?
Right.
So you believe that Allah is real?
Right.
Why?
Well, okay, if you have to start right now, obviously I was born into the Muslim faith, so that's how it all starts.
But you and I would hope you and I would agree, because we agreed on this stuff, that what religious tradition you were born into has no bearing on whether or not it's true.
No, definitely. I know that's not.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to double check, because I asked you why you believe, and you started with something that I think we'd all recognize as irrelevant. So.
No, definitely. But I'm like, the reason I believe obviously starts off from there, because that's where, like it started off there, because I was born into it. And then after that, obviously now as an adult, I have better reasons.
Okay.
So yeah. So from there, then when a person starts looking into things as a Muslim, and then first, I mean, I'd like have to assume that most people don't even question this thing and just keep believing whatever they're believing.
I would agree with you again.
Yep. I am like studying it to a certain extent and whatever. And before that, nothing seemed to logically contradict about the whole thing. I know that's not a proof or anything in and of itself.
Okay, so there's a second or third thing that isn't why you believe or anything relevant. Can we get to why you actually believe?
Okay, here we get to the point. Well, the strongest proof that I'd have to give is like the Quran itself, some of the claims that it makes and some of the things that it shows. And I wouldn't say that any of these things could be shown to be definite to another person. But as we mentioned earlier, like reasonable probability, looking at things and considering the fact that I first of all assume that there is a prime mover or a first cause.
Well, there's your problem.
Why would you assume that?
I mean, that seems... So here's the problem. If your reason for believing is based on an assumption, which essentially is the conclusion... Now you've got a circular argument. If you begin by assuming there must be a prime mover, now you're looking for what that prime mover is.
Yeah, you've just made a choice to believe in the one that you were born into. If you're making an assumption that there's a God to begin with, then now you're just going to go with the one that you were born in with, and you've looked for good reasons to believe that, because after all, that's where you fit. But the assumption that there's a God is the problem to begin with.
No, okay, I probably should have used better choice of words. I didn't mean, I said assume, but I meant like, it's not that I haven't looked at like to me, when I look at the argument, whether the argument based on the fact that there's change in the world, specificity, finitude, these sort of things, which indicate to a prime mover. I thought that when I said assume, that was probably a mistake on my part.
Well,
I meant things like the fact that
we've got a big problem here, and of course we're running up with a potential limited time, because after several examples of things that were irrelevant, we tried to move to something more specific. And your specific was, well, the Quran says some things, which you never point at what any of them are, that you found impactful or convincing. And then it's because you already believed in a prime mover, because that is an inference you make because of, we'll just stick with one word that you mentioned, specificity, which I would argue most likely the thing that you're talking about with regard to specificity is also an inference. You are looking at the way things work and inferring that those things are specified to work in that way by an intelligence, rather than recognizing that they are following natural law and physics and chemistry, and that the specificity that you see and want to put in there is not something that is, it's not like there was a being that said, yep, here's how we're going to dictate how this works, but is instead us trying to make sense of how things work.
Okay, so let's just, if we're looking at it from I mentioned 4 things. The easiest one to explain would probably be like change, the fact that whatever movement caused this current movement and the one before it and the one before it and so on, eventually leads to a prime mover. That sort of thing I'm looking at. And I know it's an inference and it might not be.
It doesn't
logically.
Okay, so first of all, it doesn't lead to a prime mover necessarily. You don't have any way to rule out an infinite regress, despite the potential abstract issues that people raise with an infinite regress, which I addressed last week on the show by talking about Zeno's paradox. It's a matter of how you perceive these things. You are seeing, oh, well, there must have been something that began it all. Well, our modern cosmology has the best current example that supports the evidence is the Big Bang cosmological model, which may or may not be accurate or completely accurate. But what we do know is that prior to a very short period of time immediately after the expansion, prior to that, we don't have any ability to explore. We don't have any ability to investigate. We don't even have a reason to think that there was time before that. And so we are at a point then, when it comes to the origin of the universe, or why is there something rather than nothing, where the only reasonable answer is, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And you must realize, Ismail, that of course, living over here, we usually deal with Christians more than Muslims, I guess, in my experience anyway, my circle of people. But if you start with the baseline that there must be something that started this thing, that there's a creator, there's a force out there of some kind, let's just call it God. If you start with that baseline, then every religion then goes down its own road with their own holy book. I mean, Christians over here will do the same thing you're doing with the Quran, where they'll say there's all these things in the Bible that we say that this happened and that happened, and this what makes sense to me. And so you must realize that all these religions who are exclusive to one another and exclusive of one another and all claim to be the way, truth, and life are competing against one another, and they can't all be right. You realize that, right?
Yeah, but like in our worldview as Islam, we accept like Christianity and Judaism to be previously correct religions. So they wouldn't
That's not possible.
How is that possible?
That is what Muslims say, but it's only because they don't actually understand Christian doctrine. Because, and I'm not going to beat you up for this, but during my debate with Cy Ten Bruggencate, he made the point, because he argues with Muslims quite frequently, that if Muslims' views on Christianity is true, then Christianity must be true, which means Islam is false.
Exactly.
And Cy is not wrong. One of the few areas where he's not wrong, because if your view, if a Muslim view of Jesus is that he was just a prophet, and the Christian view is that he is co-equal with God and died, those two things are now in conflict. So in much the same way that there's no such thing as Judeo-Christian, that's a marketing ploy in order to get Jews and Christians to work together towards a common goal, what you're actually advocating is like Muslimianity. And that's not a real thing either. And so while Muslims will constantly say, oh, we accept Christianity as a proper prior truth, it's only because you don't know what it says. If Christianity is true, Islam cannot be true.
Yeah, if the current day Christianity is not true, or is true, obviously Islam cannot be true. But I meant that we accept Jesus as a messenger and Moses as a messenger and that sort of thing. Not that.
Well, there's another one of your problems, because you don't have any reason to think that Jesus even necessarily existed, let alone that you have any accurate representation of his words. You have even less reason to think that Moses existed or had any accurate representation of word. So really, this is marketing. This is, we're not saying your religion is completely false. Clearly, there are some truths there, and it's because we're tied together at Isaac and Ishmael, and that's the only reason that Muslims even acknowledge this sort of thing, is because all of these are Abrahamic religions. And so if we're going to go back to the same point, the same God, you have to say, oh, well, yes, we follow Allah, and Abraham and Sarah had Isaac and Ishmael. Well, Sarah didn't have it, but you got Isaac and Ishmael, and it leads off in different directions, and now we've got this, the true prophet. And the problem here is that all of those are just claims. They are no more better grounded or founded than the claims of any of the religions you don't accept.
Okay, but back to the infinite regress, I just want to know, I also called in with the intent of getting your take on the infinite regress. I didn't listen last week, so I just want to know, is it not necessarily true that there can't be an infinite regress?
I have no idea.
There's your answer.
Okay, because generally if there was an infinite regress, then we wouldn't have got here, that whole argument.
Well, so that is a problem with an assumption that time is necessarily infinite, which is not what cosmology shows, as far as we can tell. And so we can't go back any further than this point in time. But let's imagine, so the set of positive whole numbers. So first of all, infinity is not a quantity; it's a concept. It describes something, and there's not just one infinity. There are a variety of different infinities. For example, the set of positive integers is infinite. There's no end to that set, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So is the set of negative integers, right?
Right.
So is the set of negative and positive integers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we looked at that and we said, which infinity is bigger, the set of negative and positive integers or the set of just positive integers, wouldn't we be acknowledging that one infinity is somehow bigger than another?
That's like the whole crux of the thing. So are they bigger or are they the same?
Yeah, that's the problem, is that infinity isn't a quantity. And when you try to compare how big is this infinity versus how big is this infinity, you are treating it as a quantity, when what it really means is, and there's each of those, by the way, positive integers are one-directionally infinite, and negative integers are also one-directionally infinite, but the set of negative and positives is universally infinite, although it's probably not the word. It might be bidirectionally. I don't know. So the example that I gave last week, are you familiar with Zeno's paradox? Because I'll do it real quickly again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I know it.
So the arrow's got to get halfway, and before it can get halfway, it's got to get halfway. Yeah. So if you view that, it would look like the arrow could never move, let alone get to its target. And yet we know that that's wrong.
Right.
So there's something fundamentally wrong with breaking things down and inserting infinities. And so when people ask me about time, as far as I know, time began with the Big Bang. I'm not remotely an expert in this. I don't know how we would prove it. I don't have any expertise that way. But when people say, if it was infinite, you could never get to this point, I don't think that that's true, because the set of negative and positive integers is infinite, and yet we can certainly get from 2 to 5. And, if you picked a starting point and moved forward, so that starting point is perhaps arbitrary. You could call it Big Bang, you could call it whatever, you could call it zero. You can certainly get either direction from there. You could even get from -5 to positive 28. This is the problem here is how we think about infinities. It is an incredibly difficult concept to grasp, and we are not even good at grasping the much simpler concepts. And so when somebody says, well, everything couldn't have existed forever, I agree with you. Our understanding of the universe is that, I didn't exist forever, this planet didn't exist forever, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know that the substance from which this universe expanded I'm reluctant to call it a singularity or point because then we'll get emails. But I don't know that wasn't infinite. I also don't know whether or not the thing that if there is some external thing that made the universe expand rather than something it did on its own, I don't know anything about that thing and whether or not it's endless or infinite or not. And so when people say, oh, well, we need to invent a God as a prime mover to start this all off, otherwise we can't do anything. Mm-hmm. Well, that God is supposedly infinite, right? How can God do anything if he's infinite? If I can't if I can't get here on an infinite timeline, then God can't do it either.
No, but I mean that's slightly separate things. I mean the infinite timeline would be a collection formed by successive addition from the beginning of time till now, whereas God being infinite wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the beginning of the universe till now, that sort of time.
Well, is your view of Allah that he is outside of space and time?
Yeah.
Then how can he do anything if he's outside of time? Because all action is temporal. It requires movement. It requires action, and outside of time, you can have none of that, right?
Yeah. See, that's the problem I have. Yeah. We even if we arrived at a conclusion that there's a God that started all this, that made this happen, that spun this thing into action, we're then wrestling with which God and which brand of faith do we buy into, and then we're back to where we started the conversation.
Kinda.
Whereas we don't. How do you know it's yours? How do I know it's mine? How do we? They all compete with one another.
That's the thing is, Ismail is trying to skip that part.
Exactly.
To say, okay, once we begin with there must be a prime mover, here's why I think it's the right one.
And my bigger issue.
And I'm saying I have no idea that there's a prime mover, and I don't see any justification for it. So all of your, it'd be like if we assume that there's a living dinosaur or a living ape creature hiding in the hills in Montana.
Then how are we going to fight him? Then we start there.
Let me tell you why I think it's Bigfoot and not Yeti. When I'm sitting here saying, why do we think there's this thing out there in the first place? And at least with Bigfoot, there are people who can say, oh, well, we found footprints or fur, or there's this shaky cam footage, and then we can discuss whether or not that's enough to reach a reasonable conclusion about it. It turns out it's not, and we know there are forgeries.
Shocking.
But when we ask people, how do you reach this conclusion about a prime mover, what we get are philosophical arguments that aren't supported by any evidence, and they tend to include concepts like infinity that we pretend we understand when we probably don't.
Yeah. And the bigger issue for me is...
Another thing on people use the flying spaghetti monster or the Bigfoot. I don't know, is that really a good analogy? Because here we're dealing with the universe did begin, so is it a conscious mover or is it not a conscious mover?
Sure.
Whereas the Bigfoot doesn't have any explanatory power in any way.
Well, Bigfoot would have explanatory power for the discovery of those footprints and fur.
Okay, right. Yeah.
God is the thing. God is the thing with no explanatory power.
If we wrote a book about Bigfoot, he'd be in the conversation, right? I mean, yeah.
I guess.
But
God is the thing that God is the thing that has no explanatory power. It is an attempt to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, but okay, you're right about the Bigfoot thing because there are those footprints and that. But I'm saying the flying spaghetti monster, when people use that example...
Okay, just stop with that. This flying spaghetti monster isn't real. It's not a real religion. I am ordained by the Pastafarians. This was satire that was created to counter creationists, and people started off doing it for funsies, and then people were like, "Oh, well, I'm just going to claim it's a real." It's not a real fucking religion. It was for fun. So let's not bring that one up.
No, I know it's not a real religion. I mean, some people really use that in their arguments. So I'm just asking. Okay, just one more thing.
To bring it up with those people.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
You're right. Just one more thing. When sometimes you say, okay, we'll grant the prime mover, but how do you know it's conscious? Okay, that's obviously skipping the first step.
Sure.
But and then Cosmic Skeptic once gave the example of sometimes we see things which are first movers, which are conscious, like a person dropping something, and sometimes we see things which are first movers that are not conscious, like the cloud dropping rain.
Sure.
So how do we know which first mover, is this first mover conscious or not?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm thinking isn't also that analogy, I was just thinking about it, because the cloud it's something made the cloud, there was something before that. So is it worthy to use that as an analogy for first mover?
Okay.
I don't know if you know what I'm saying.
So it's always going to be valid as an analogy for first mover because analogies aren't direct, they are analogous. And so, yeah, there was something, the cloud formed from water vapor. There's an entire water cycle here. And so you would have to get back to make it directly analogous. How did the water cycle begin? We know what the water cycle is. We know that clouds drop rain, it comes down, it gets soaked in, and then it gets evaporated and everything else, and then you get clouds again, you get this water cycle going. When did the water cycle begin and how?
No, I don't know. I'm saying
I'm legitimately asking you, when did the water cycle begin and how did it begin?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't either. And if that's a good enough answer for us to ask to give for that water cycle, then why isn't it a good enough answer for the origin of the universe, which we know millions of times less about?
Yep.
It would, but this is a question that has a lot of impact. Whereas when did the water?
Doesn't matter how impactful the question is.
You can't make up an answer.
The only issue is how accurate is the answer, not how impactful is the question. There are massive questions that could have massive impact on everything, and yet the right answer to them for the entirety of human history, right up to now, is I don't know. And my objection here is that there are people who are claiming that they do know.
No, as I said, okay, you just asked why isn't I don't know a good enough answer. So I'm saying we'd want to search more and try better in the case of this than the water cycle.
I agree. We should try more and search and then put together evidence to show that the conclusion that we're leaning towards or accepting is most likely correct. Isn't that what we would do?
Yeah.
Why hasn't religion done that? Not just yours, any of them. Where is the investigative process and evidence that leads to the conclusion that that particular religion is right?
Okay, so I know we've taken up a lot of time so far, but when it comes to I'm going to be skipping the first step of the prime mover, but just to give you a quick,
we're skipping all the steps of the prime mover, and we're gonna go on because I got some other callers to get to. But here's what I'd like you to do, and everybody else do this as an exercise. Go back and listen to this call again, and anytime I asked a question that got a simple, straightforward, direct, easy answer, make a note of that. And anytime I asked a question that should have the same answer that the question before it got, where what I got from you was something completely unrelated to the question or dodging or dancing, make a note of that. This is the exercise that this entire show has been about forever, for as long as I've been doing it, which is, let me ask you a question. When did the water cycle begin and how? And you quickly say, I don't know. Now, your answer probably should have been, it started at the time when Allah said that it was going to be started and in the way that Allah dictated that it would be started. That's probably the answer as a Muslim you should have given, because now you're not saying that you know the specifics, but that you know there was a God behind it, because that's exactly what you're doing with the origin of the universe. And yet when I ask about the water cycle, I get an I don't know. When I ask about the nature of evidence and demonstrating these sorts of things with analogies, with coins, and other things that are specific, I get answers that are reasonable. You and I are on exactly the same page on every one of those. And yet when we get to religion, it's a tap dance. Mm-hmm. That is important. We're out of time. Think about that. Call us back another time, and maybe we'll have